Thank you so much, Ellen, for that beautiful start, and to Greg, who's been a wonderful minister here for so long. He invited me to talk briefly about a book I just wrote. I was finally, and it'll be short. I just want to tell you that. I was asking myself, why have I been teaching for decades about the stories of Jesus? I mean, look, the earliest manuscript is 15 pages long. How much more can anyone say about that? And why do I still love those stories? And so I started to ask myself the questions I was asking myself, and I thought I'd tell you what a couple of those questions are, and then we'll just jump into a discussion. So this won't be too long. The first question, and the obvious one that people ask if they're not so familiar with the sources, is Jesus is said to walk on water and have a virgin birth and rise from the dead and heal the sick and raise the dead. Is this about a real person, or was he a fictional person like these? And some people think he didn't exist. So I looked at that, and I found out there's only one thing that everybody who spoke about Jesus of Nazareth in the first century knew about him. They knew that he was crucified by the Roman governor Pilate for revolution against Rome. And this is what was over the cross: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. We know he was executed by the Roman governor. Now, that's the one thing that everybody who followed him agreed upon. They all write it in the Gospels, people who loved him and people who hated him. These people, called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who wrote the New Testament Gospels, all tell the story about Jesus being crucified. And there are people who despise Jesus, and they also knew the same fact on the ground. For example, the Roman senator Tacitus, who despised Jesus and his followers, he called this man Christus. He said he was a notorious man. He was crucified and then started a crazy superstition where it started in Rome and Judea, and it's disgusting, and these terrible, ignorant people follow it. Another person in the first century who knew about Jesus and didn't like him was Josephus, the scholar who wrote the Jewish War. He said, some of the leading men among us accused him to Pilate, and we had him crucified. A third person is another Roman historian who wrote about the life of Nero, and he talked about some guy named Christus who was causing trouble in Rome. His followers were a superstitious bunch, and they were hung up on poles and burned alive in Nero's gardens. So the point is that people who loved Jesus and people who hated him all agree on that. That's what we know. So he was one of thousands of Jews. I didn't realize how many till I started working on this. Thousands of Jews who were crucified in Judea on the same charge because their people were rebelling against Rome in the name of God and our common liberty. To me, it sounds a lot like the American revolutionaries, right? Trying to get rid of the British king. And they paid the price for it. They suffered a terrible defeat. So that's the first reason why I think definitely there was such a person, a real person. And I got interested, of all things, in the miracles. So I'm here to talk about miracles. So the second question was, why are all these miracles? The person who raised this question was Thomas Jefferson. He thought Jesus' ethics were very good, his morals were very good, but the miracles were ridiculous. He said, I just get rid of those. So he actually cut them out of his Bible. This is his Bible. If you go to Monticello, where in his study, you can see the Jefferson Bible. He called it The Life and Morals of the Great Prophet of Nazareth. But all the miracle stories have been cut out, literally, because they're irrelevant. That's Jefferson's view. Now, so I asked myself, why do miracles matter so much in the Gospels? At the time, this is my guess, Jesus was a preacher, a prophet, who was saying, the kingdom of God is coming, and it's coming soon. Now, you could stand out on the street, out there, Pepke Park, and say, the kingdom of God is coming, the end of time is coming soon. But who would believe you? In that world, if you could show that you had divine power, if you could show that God authorized you, you would have special power. And the miracles are told to validate the prophecies. So these are the first images we have of Jesus of Nazareth. They were found in the catacombs, in the caves, inscribed on the walls in the first century. And Jesus is pictured especially as a healer. Here there's a woman touching his robe, and she's suddenly healed. Some of you know that story. On the top is a man carrying his litter because he was crippled, and Jesus just healed him, and he can now walk. He's actually also pictured with a magic wand, because some people thought, how does he do it? How does he do the healings? His enemies said, well, you know what? He really went to Egypt, because in Egypt, you could learn magic spells. These are magic gems from Egypt. They have images of divine beings. This one, I think, is Abraxas. And the magic gems are something, they're all kind of colors. It could be red, and if you have trouble with your heart, you could put the gem on your heart, and it would have the deity that could heal your heart, and it would have the magic words that you need. So these have magic words. Over there we have a magic spell, that's from Egypt, and these are also more magic gems. And so there were also many people who studied magic. Now this is a world where there are no hospitals. And the only people who have doctors are people like the emperor, who are very rich. And the doctors couldn't do very much. They didn't have the medicines we do, of course. And so most people went to healers if they were sick. And many people went to magicians to get healed. And many thought Jesus did that. So the stories in the Gospels say, well, you know some of them. He healed a blind man. How did he do it? Well, Mark's Gospel says he took spit from his mouth, and he put it on the man's eyes, and he mixed it with mud, and then he said some words, and the man could see, right? In another story in Mark 7, he heals a man who is deaf, and people wanted to know, how did he do it? Why? Because maybe you could do it if you learned the technique. These are things magicians did, actually. He put spit on the man's mouth, and he said a word. He said, apapatha, which means be opened. He said it in his language, Aramaic, dialogue of Hebrew. And I think people, why did they put it in a gospel written in Greek? It's because if you knew the right words, it might work better. So these are there so that followers of Jesus could learn how to do healing in his name, most likely. And he used some of the techniques that were known. So that's why some people said he was just doing magic. You know the story about how he healed a girl. Her parents totally devastated because the servants came out and said she's dead. Don't bother him anymore. And but he went anyway to the house where she had apparently died. And the Greek word is komeo. And he said, no, she's asleep. Now the word we have coma comes from komeo, which means to sleep. Maybe she was in a coma, and maybe he aroused her. We don't know what happened. Maybe she was dead. But the point is, the words are again given in Aramaic, talitha kum. That's because maybe if you were going to try it, this might work. That's the guess of scholars who work on this. But today I just want to talk for a couple of minutes about the biggest miracles. What about the virgin birth or the resurrection? Why are there stories about a virgin birth anyway? I suggest it's because the earliest gospel written was the Gospel of Mark, before any others had been written. It was written 40 years after the death of Jesus. It was written for hearsay that Mark had heard and gathered anecdotes, stories, things people had heard when they listened to Jesus, when they were around him, and he put them in a short account. But there's no birth story. He doesn't ever talk about that. In fact, the first scene in Mark, if you remember, Jesus is a grown-up man, or he's a young man. He's certainly not a baby. And he's going out to hear John the Baptist preach. And what happens is that he accepts baptism from John the Baptist, and then he goes out to preach himself. But there's no birth story. Where does he come from? There are clues in Mark that he didn't get along with his family, or something was a little off there. In Mark 3:21, have you ever noticed? It says, when Jesus speaks in prophecy and he's doing healings in public, it says, hoi, yeah, well, Greek won't help here. His relatives went out to seize him because they said, he's out of his mind. Now, they used to say, some people said, because you can translate the term, the people said, but the word is his relatives, and probably it's his mother and his brothers. Now, if you read new translations, it'll say his family went out to seize him, and they were afraid of what he was doing. When he went back to Nazareth, this is only in chapter 6 in Mark, he starts preaching and offering to do healings. And people say, where did this guy get this? I mean, I'm translating Greek. It's actually, who's this guy? They don't use the word guy. It's titatis. Who's that? Where does he get this stuff? Isn't this Jesus, the son of Mary? We know his brothers, James and Joseph and Judas and Simon. We know his sisters. I mean, who is this guy anyway? They don't believe in him. They don't think he can heal. And he couldn't heal people there. He said he was very disappointed. And he was frustrated and left in distress from Nazareth. The neighbors didn't believe him either. Now, at the same time, sources written by his enemies, and these were members of the Jewish community who said, oh, that Jesus of Nazareth, he wasn't even legitimate. He didn't have a recognized father. They called him a mamzer, which means, well, the English would be bastard or illegitimate. So the rumors were that he didn't have any kind of family that you'd want to know about. And the questions, and yet they were calling him Son of God. So how does that work? 10 or 20 years later, after Mark wrote that first account, two other people said, we've got to change it. We've got to revise it. They were each working independently. We call them Matthew and Luke. They didn't write different gospels. They just expanded Mark. What they did is they add a birth story, and they add miracle stories, and they add teachings. They add more material that they had learned about Jesus since Mark wrote. But they also each wrote a birth story because they thought something is really missing here. The Gospel of Luke starts with a birth story, and these are based on the Bible. Now, of course, you remember that the people who write the Gospels are not writing a Bible. They have no idea that this will be a Bible. Their Bible is the Hebrew Bible, of course. So when they're talking about a birth of Jesus, how do they do it? Well, I'll go back to Luke. Luke starts with the story of Abraham and Sarah. And if you know the story of Abraham and Sarah, it says they had no children. And Sarah was 99 years old. She was far too old to have a baby. And some angels come to her husband Abraham and say, your wife is going to have a son, and his name will be Isaac. And she laughs. Right? What? That's ridiculous. So they call him Isaac, which means laughter. She has a baby miraculously when it's biologically impossible. So that's a story about how God overcomes natural obstacles. And so he puts the story of the old priest and the priest's wife, too old to have a baby. It's patterned on the story of Abraham and Sarah to say, look, God does miracles. He did it in the time of Abraham and Sarah, and he can do it now. And the second story to which Luke refers is the story of the birth of Samuel, which is about a young woman, a married woman, who's disgraced in her town because she just can't conceive. And for a Jewish woman, that is a tremendous suffering, disgrace. The husband would be told to take another wife who can have a baby or divorce her and marry somebody else. But she went to the temple every day and she prays to the Lord for a child. And she says, if you give me a son, I'll bring him to the temple and he will serve you. So her prayers are answered. She conceives and she has a child named Samuel. And that is, again, a gift from God, understood as a miraculous birth. So Luke wants to say, look, there are miraculous births. God can do this. And even if Jesus doesn't have an ordinary birth, something could have happened that was amazing. And after that, he tells the story of Mary, who conceives a child with no relationship with a man, a young virgin, and it's a miracle. And it sort of works in the context of the biblical stories. Matthew's writing independently. He doesn't know that Luke is writing something like this, so he adds a birth story patterned on the story of Moses. And you can remember that Moses, when he was born, was in danger because the Pharaoh was killing Jewish babies, so the Bible says. Here's the Pharaoh ordering the midwives to kill the infants of the Jewish slaves. And the mother of Moses refuses to allow her baby to be killed. The midwife conspires with her. They hide him. And then he's picked up by the daughter of the Pharaoh and raised in the palace. You know the story. So the birth of Moses is a story about a very endangered child, endangered by the most powerful man in Egypt, and his family has to escape for him to survive. So Luke tells a story rather like that. Luke tells a story, as you know, about a very humble couple from Nazareth. The woman is pregnant. She gives birth in a stable, and angels arrive. And that's part of the beautiful story of Christmas. Matthew gives you a completely different story, in case you haven't noticed. Matthew patterns it, as I said, on the story of Moses. So instead of the Pharaoh who's trying to kill all the Jewish babies, it's King Herod who orders the slaughter of all the babies under 2 years old because he's afraid of a prince being born. And Matthew's story is not about a humble baby, the one pictured by Rembrandt, but of a baby who's already the ruler of the world, beautifully pictured as the emperor, and escaping a slaughter by an evil king because his family escapes into Egypt. So Matthew tells a story like that, patterned on Moses. Now, and then, that's it. Later, they put them all together. You find actually kings going to a stable, and the ox looks very much interested because this hasn't happened before. So you have shepherds, you have kings, you have angels, you have everything in the Christmas pageant that you might have been in. I was in it once. You could be an angel or a sheep or whatever. But both of the stories are just sort of put into one lovely narrative. And you don't notice that they're two very different versions. Why do they tell elaborate stories about Jesus' birth based on miracles in the Hebrew Bible? Something about the birth of Jesus is troublesome. And it's not only Jewish critics of Jesus, his detractors who say he's illegitimate. Even John's gospel says people said, he's not even legitimately born. He doesn't even have a a father, let alone a father who's a king of Israel, a genealogy going back to King David. You can't be serious about that. So, well, I wrote in the book about what people think happened, and I won't go into it now, but some people say it was a story that she couldn't tell. It might have been a story about rape, because of the many Roman soldiers in the area who actually were known to capture innocent young Jewish boys and girls and rape them under their control. And it would have had to be a story nobody could tell. And did that happen? We don't know. But it is a possible, it could be a reason why this story was absolutely never told and had to be told in a very different way. And as I say, nobody knows. In John's gospel, there's no birth story. Where does Jesus come from in John? In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the light. And John would say, I'm not going to write about that. Where does he come from? He comes from God. That's enough. He comes from the divine light. And Mark, of course, has no birth story. So there were people who tried to investigate what happened historically. A Roman Catholic scholar, Jane Shaberg, wrote this book, and I didn't read it when it first came out in 1980 because I thought it was a sensationalist thing, and it just sounded kind of sleazy. But it actually is a serious investigation of these questions, and she came out with a suggestion about that. And the massive book that everybody reads in the field is by Raymond Brown, who was a colleague of mine at Union Seminary. He wrote The Birth of the Messiah. And he said, well, yeah, there are those stories, and they may be true, but I think it's a theological concept and not a biological one. Let's just leave it at that. So we don't know what happened. But later I realized, after I'd written about this, Mark does not ignore the question of whether Jesus has a legitimate father. It's the very first opening. The Gospel of Mark opens. This is the good news of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. So in the opening line, he says, whose son is he? He's God's son. That's enough. And secondly, the first very scene, right? Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist, and God says, there he is, this is my beloved son. Listen to him. Now, you don't need more authority than that. And Mark basically said, God speaks for him. And Jesus had a vision in which he recognized that he was God's beloved son. So that's what Mark does. And of course, these aren't literal words. These are poetic words. It's the way to talk about miracles. And that the story of the virgin birth comes out of those reflections. One more miracle, and then we'll open it up. What about resurrection? Coming back after one is dead. This is the biggest miracle and the biggest question. What happens when we die? Now, when Mark wrote the earliest gospel, it ends in a really strange way. It doesn't end where it ends in the Bible you have, which it ends at 20 or something, chapter 16, verse 20. It stopped at 16, verse 8, because originally Mark wrote it like this. He said, the women went to the tomb after Jesus died and he'd been buried in the tomb, but somebody had opened the tomb up, and there was nobody there. And there was a man standing in the tomb saying, you're looking for Jesus? He's not here. He's been raised. And they're shocked. And they're terrified. And the last line of the Gospel of Mark originally is, and the women ran away in terror and said nothing to anyone because they were terrified. Something uncanny had happened. And other people said, you can't leave it there. You've got to end it better. So they add resurrection stories to Mark. But if you look at a new edition of your Gospels, it will note that this is not the original, that they don't now give you the original ending. Instead, later people added endings to Mark in which Jesus appears. Literally, they put him in the picture. And when Matthew tells a story, he tells a much more elaborate story. He says, the women were terrified, and then they saw Jesus, and they ran up to him, and they grabbed his feet and worshiped him. Now, that's an important detail because people in the ancient world knew that ghosts don't have feet. So this says, effectively, he was actually physically there. They touched him, and they realized he was alive. And then Matthew says, well, they ran away, but they ran away in joy to tell the disciples. Mark says they didn't tell anyone, but Matthew says, oh, yes, of course, they told the disciples. The disciples didn't believe them initially, but later they had proof. And Matthew says, and furthermore, enormous things happened when Jesus died. If you've been to Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives, today there are 100,000 graves on the Mount of Olives. Because when the Messiah comes, the teaching is that when the Messiah comes, he will come there. And those who are buried there will rise out of their graves to greet him. And so if you want to be in the right place at that dramatic moment, you should be buried there, and people are still being buried there. And this is what it looks like, but there are thousands of graves. And Matthew says, when Jesus died, there was a huge earthquake, and there was darkness at noon, and the bodies of the saints who had died came out of their graves, and they went into Jerusalem and appeared to many people. Did you notice this detail? It's in there. And then Matthew goes on. It's even more dramatic. He says, and then there was another great earthquake, and an angel descended from heaven and rolled away the stone that was over the grave and sat on it. And the guards of the tomb fell down like dead men, and the angel said to the women, go tell his brothers he is not here. And then they run for fear and great joy, and they tell the disciples. So it's a better story than Mark's, actually. If you like this kind of ending. And then Matthew goes on to say that Jesus ascended up into heaven, and then instructed his disciples to meet him on the Mount of Olives, and he descends from heaven, and he gives them the Great Commission, go out and preach to all nations the gospel, and baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So that's Matthew's addition to what Mark had said. So the Gospels, interestingly, usually speak about Jesus' resurrection. What does it mean? It means he came out of the grave. The grave was empty. They saw him and they believed. So. But when Paul, the apostle, now he's writing before the gospel writers. He's writing around the year 40, maybe 10 years after the death of Jesus, 40, 50 to 60. The gospels haven't been written yet. And when Paul says, how are the dead raised, you're asking me? Well, with what body do they come? And the answer that the gospel writers give is he was a physical presence. So if you look at Luke, this is a story where the disciples are hiding because they're terrified that they're going to be crucified and captured just like Jesus. So they're in a locked room. This is Luke 24. And Jesus appears through the locked doors. So he is not in his ordinary body. He is in a different kind of body, which is not stopped by material walls. And they're terrified. And he sees that they're terrified, and he says, wait, touch me. And you'll see I'm not a ghost. They thought it was a ghost. That's what Luke says. And then he says, I'm not a ghost. And then he says, touch me and see. You'll see. I have flesh and bones just like you. And they touch him, and they sort of are still astonished. And he says, wait, do you have anything to eat? So they give him a piece of fish, and he eats. So what's the point? Ghosts don't eat. So this is demonstration that Jesus is really physically present after he died. And that is the way that the Gospels very often speak of their relationship with Jesus after he died. But Luke also tells a different kind of story. This is the one where he appears sometimes in a form that doesn't look like Jesus. So this is the story about the road to Emmaus, when two followers of Jesus are grieving and saying, "Oh, that whole thing that happened with Jesus is so awful." And they meet a stranger, and they said, "Don't you know what happened? Jesus of Nazareth was crucified." And they talk about it all the way until they get to the inn where they're going, and they invite him to dinner. And as soon as he breaks the bread, the story says, suddenly they say, "It's Jesus." And he vanishes. So these stories aren't about feeling him physically and seeing him physically raised and a corporeal appearance of Jesus, but it's about a vision. And this is a different kind of story, and there are different kinds of stories in all the Gospels. In John's Gospel, for example, the disciples see Jesus coming through a locked door, and they rejoice, and they see that it's really Jesus. And they go tell Thomas that we saw him. He's alive. And you know the story. Thomas said, "I don't believe it." So Jesus comes back a second time just for Thomas. And he says, "Touch me and see." And this is Caravaggio's great painting of Thomas poking his finger in the side of Jesus and feeling the wounds and saying, "You're right. He's physically back." So John tells a story, as Luke does, about a physical appearance. But he can tell different kinds of stories too. For example, he can tell stories about a vision where Jesus appears, but you don't recognize who he is at first. So this is the one where Mary Magdalene goes out to the grave, and she's weeping because it's empty. And she sees someone, and she thinks he's the gardener, and she says, "Where did you put him? Where's his body? I want to go get it." This is Rembrandt's picturing Jesus with a gardener's hat and a trowel. He's ready to work in the garden. And then Jesus turns to her and says, "Mary." And she says, "Rabboni," meaning my rabbi, my teacher. Very powerful encounter. Suddenly, she recognizes that the person she didn't recognize is actually her teacher, her beloved Jesus. And she speaks to him, and he says, "Don't touch me. I haven't yet ascended. I don't have that kind of body yet." So both of these kinds of stories are told. And I wondered, why do they tell stories that are contradictory to each other? Either that you could touch him and feel him and he was really right there, or that he was somebody they didn't recognize and they suddenly saw in a vision. And I realized that if you're writing these stories, they wanted as many witnesses as they could get of something so astonishing. So any stories, I think they just gathered all of the anecdotes they heard, and they heard a lot of them, about how Jesus was alive and people had seen him. So that's why I think they were not concerned that the stories weren't the same. Paul has a very different view from the Gospels. When Paul is asked, "With what body do the dead come?" And he says something very different. He says, "Well, the body is like a seed that we put in the ground, and what comes out is not what you buried. What emerges is a different kind of body, is a new life in a different form." That's the metaphor. He says it's sown a physical body in the ground, and it's raised a spiritual body. And he goes on to say, well, on earth, there's all kinds of bodies. Animals have bodies. We can see and touch animal bodies and each other's bodies, but there are some bodies that are just, they're just bodies of light. They're just emanations of light. They're not tangible, but you can see them sometimes. And he says the resurrection is like that. It's like that. Spiritual bodies are not like physical bodies. Earthly bodies are planted in the ground like ordinary human bodies, but what's raised is a spiritual body. It's different. And he says, I can't tell you what it's like. It's a mystery. If there's any mystery, it's this one. What happens when we die? And he says, well, this is the mystery, as far as I can tell you. We'll be changed. We'll be transformed. So he focuses not on continuity between this body and whatever we become after we die, but on discontinuity. He says, well, there's two kinds of bodies. There's this kind, and the other kind is immaterial, like Christ's body, not like Adam's body, not like an ordinary human, but like a transformed human being. And after all, if you ask Paul, well, how did Jesus look when you saw him, when he appeared to you? Paul never said he saw a human being. He said he saw a blinding light. He saw brilliant light. That's what he saw. And that's why Caravaggio paints this picture of him blinded by the light, thrown down from his horse. He saw blinding light, and he heard a voice speaking to him. And that's why he understood that Jesus was alive. But it wasn't about a physical body. It was about a different kind of experience entirely. And that's what, though Paul has a very different view, that resurrection, that after we die, we transform in some mysterious way. We transform into some other kind of reality, which we can't possibly understand. One of the secret gospels is accompanied by this one called the Treatise on Resurrection, where a young man says to his teacher, do I have to believe resurrection? Is that real? And his teacher says, absolutely yes. Resurrection is at the heart of the message. Jesus transformed himself into an imperishable being and opened the way for us. Don't think this is an illusion. It's the truth. Resurrection is the discovery of what's actually real, a reality beyond the one in which we're living now, a transformation. So to this day, if you've noticed, when Christians say a creed, they can say quite different things about life after death. It is always affirmed. And I was struck by this, writing about miracles. And the older I get, the more I hope and trust that it might be true. That there's some other transformation that happens after death. But there's two different creeds. And if you've been in the Episcopal Church or the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, you might have said either one. But they're kind of interchangeable. But one, the Apostles' Creed, oldest creed, I believe in the resurrection of the body and the life of the world to come. Physical resurrection. Although some people say the body of Christ is the church. So it's the resurrection of the church. But it's likely the resurrection of the body. That physical, what the Gospels say, is affirmed in the Apostles' Creed. But in the Nicene Creed, which is almost interchangeable for many of our churches, I believe in the resurrection of the dead. It's not about the body. But when people die, they're transformed, and the life of the world to come. That's the Nicene Creed. So you can have it in different forms, the conviction that resurrection is a real miracle, and I hope it is. I thought of my favorite poets, or some of them, Christians, all of them. John Donne in the 16th century, the famous poem, "Death be not proud, though some have called you mighty and dreadful, thou art not so." And the poem ends, "Death, you shall die." That's the 17th century. Gerald Manley Hopkins in the 18th century wrote that nature is a Heraclean fire and the comfort of the resurrection. He talks about all at once we shall be transformed like diamonds. We'll become what Christ is, because he was like us, and now he's transformed. Dylan Thomas in the 20th century, after the terrible bombing of London, and a poem he wrote about the death of a child by fire in the bombing of London, he said, "And death shall have no dominion," that those who are dead shall rise again. It's a very powerful affirmation of that message. So that message is still with us. I want to stop now and open up to any discussion. But what I saw in these stories, many miracles in the gospel, and I like them. I used to think, well, the focus is really on the teaching of Jesus, how we should treat each other. And I think that's crucial, that's important, that's central, right? How to treat each other. But there's something else too. That's why I call this book Miracles and Wonder. Because for the first time I was thinking, I'm not skipping over the miracles. These are important to the story. Because here's what the Bible stories do. Whether you start with Moses or whether it's Jesus. The story of Moses, as you know, it begins in oppression and slavery and suffering of his people. And it ends with him going to the promised land. The story of Daniel is thrown into the lion's den to be brutally and slowly and horribly killed, but he comes out alive. Jonah goes into the whale, and there he is, thrown out on land, and he's just fine. The point is, the stories all start in a world of suffering that we know. It's war, it's sickness, it's death. It's all kinds of difficult and painful struggle. But the stories all end with hope. So here, finally, the blind man, however Jesus did it, as the Gospels say, can see again. He was blind from birth, but the story ends in hope. The story of a young woman who might have had a painful and unexpected and unwanted pregnancy, as many people suggest, ends where she becomes honored as the Queen of Heaven. Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the aunt of St. John the Baptist. That's Raphael's portrait, and there's so many. So it ends in glory for Mary, however her pregnancy started. And finally, the most powerful story of all is Jesus, who suffers more than any of us can imagine, being abandoned by everybody and arrested and charged on a false accusation that he was starting revolution, and tortured and beaten and spit upon and crucified. Horrible. And the story ends that he comes and becomes the king of the world. So I just thought, why do I love these stories? They start in the world we live in and with the sufferings that we're familiar with, and they end in hope. And I realize I love that. I would love to affirm that. So I realize that's what I love about these stories. So I'm going to stop with that.